Today, we're tackling something huge. We're diving into the source material to explore a massive, incredibly common challenge. Exactly why stepping into full adulthood feels harder than ever right now. But more importantly, we're going to map out the exact, actionable roadmap to actually conquer it. So if you, or maybe someone you know, feels stuck in neutral, kind of struggling to make that leap to true independence, you are absolutely in the right place. Let's get right into it. Okay, so you've probably heard the phrase failure to launch, right? Well, looking at the literature, it's super important to clarify right out of the gate. This isn't some clinical diagnosis or a medical syndrome. It's really a sociological delay. It's that gap between parental dependence and true economic self-sufficiency. Basically, it describes young, emerging adults who are finding it extraordinarily difficult to take on the societal requirements of full adulthood, mostly because they just can't financially support themselves yet. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to hit the launch problem, move into the dependency trap, outline the self-sufficiency solution, and then get super practical with tracking your money flow, funding your future, and finally, the envelope strategy. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the launch problem, navigating life's inflection points. Now check out this timeline, because this isn't just a recent glitch in the system, and it's definitely not just happening in one country. Researchers actually started spotting this trend way back in the 1980s over in Europe, especially in Germany and Italy. Then, from 1984 through 2000, the data showed a very real, measurable decline in young adults becoming what economists call the household head, all across Western nations. We're talking Canada, the UK, the US. And by 2014, the data hit this massive tipping point. Living with parents officially became the #1 most common living arrangement for 18 to 34-year-olds in the US. So when does this actually happen? Well, the failure to launch almost always triggers at these major inflection points. It's those moments where society expects a massive life transition. You graduate high school, but maybe university is a struggle. Or you get through university, but making the leap to a sustained paying career, it just feels impossible. The researchers note this often boils down to lacking the specific real-world skills or even just the intrinsic confidence needed for the working world. It's like a giant gap between expectation and reality, and it can be completely paralyzing. Moving right along to Section 2, the dependency trap, the psychology of staying put. What's really fascinating in the research is looking at how different cultures experience the extremes of this. On one side, you've got the Japanese concept of hikikomori. The Japanese government defines this as an acute withdrawal into the home for over 6 months without participating in society at all. Literally no school, no work, just total isolation. Now contrast that with the Western concept of boomerang children. These are young adults who did actually launch. They moved out, went to college, got an apartment, but then they hit a wall of economic friction and had to move right back in with their parents. It just goes to show this struggle takes a lot of different forms globally. And look, we have to be fair here and recognize the macroeconomic realities. Researchers are quick to point out this is not necessarily a personal moral failing. Like this quote perfectly highlights, there is a structural shift happening. The modern economy demands way more specialized training than it did 50 years ago. The job learning life cycle has literally stretched out, which means true economic independence is naturally just going to happen later for a lot of people. But even knowing that, the sheer scale of this shift is mind-blowing. To really put that 2014 statistic I mentioned earlier into perspective, get this. When living with parents became the most common setup for 18 to 34-year-olds in the US, that was the first time that had happened since the 1880s. Let that sink in for a second. Not since the 19th century have so many young adults just stayed at home. Which brings us to a really tough psychological reality. Psychologists call this the accommodation trap. See, parents naturally want to help, right? So they offer free housing, free food, but by doing that, they unintentionally reinforce the young adult's dependency. They actually remove the exact friction that's needed to grow. So we have to ask the hard question. How on earth do we break that cycle and force the transition to true economic self-sufficiency? The answer to that brings us straight into Section 3, the self-sufficiency solution, the engine for independence. The absolute ultimate tool to secure your independence? It's a structured, beginner-friendly budget. Honestly, budgeting is quite literally the antidote to the dependency trap. Without a crystal-clear financial roadmap, launching is really just a vague hope. But the second you build a budget, it becomes an inevitable mathematical reality. But hey, before any of the math happens, you've got to gather your financial history. If you want to be self-sufficient, you have to know exactly where you stand today. The framework suggests pulling your bank and credit card statements, ideally 3 to 6 months worth, so you can catch all those weird or regular spending habits. Grab at least 2 months of your most recent pay stubs, which is super important if your income bounces around. And dig up your latest tax return if you've been at the same job for a bit. This, right here, this is the raw data of your independence. Now that we have the data, let's hit section 4, tracking your money flow. Where does it all go? The literature strongly emphasizes breaking your spending down into 2 main buckets. First up, fixed costs. These are the absolute non-negotiables that keep a roof over your head and keep you legally compliant. Rent, utilities, basic groceries, car payments, insurance. Then you've got your variable costs. This is the stuff that fluctuates every single month. Dining out, going to the movies, buying new clothes. And listen, the variable costs, that is where people usually bleed cash without even realizing it. That's exactly where the dependency trap tightens its grip. Now, here's a totally game-changing strategy from the research, identifying optional obligated costs. These are those sneaky, recurring subscriptions that feel like fixed costs but are actually completely optional. Think massive cable packages, a gym you never go to, 5 different streaming services. By taking your discretionary income and subtracting these optional obligations, you can instantly find hidden pockets of cash. Honestly, just dropping a premium cable package might literally free up enough money to kickstart an emergency fund. All right, section 5. Funding your future, paying for independence. Once you've freed up that extra cash by trimming the fat, this is where we direct it toward your escape velocity. Whether your big goal is building a solid 3-month emergency fund, or maybe saving up first and last month's rent so you can finally move out, or even just crushing some lingering credit card debt, you have to prioritize it here. A goal without a specific dollar amount attached to it is literally just a wish. You need to calculate exactly what your independence costs. Let's actually break down the math for a second, because it's way more accessible than you'd think. Let's say your immediate goal is to save $2,000 in 1 year, so you have a nice buffer to move out. Divide $2,000 by 12 months. That means you only need to free up $167 a month. When you look back at your variable costs and those optional streaming subscriptions we just talked about, finding $167 suddenly feels incredibly doable, right? But how do you actually lock this in and enforce it? That leads us to our final section, section 6, the envelope strategy, taking physical control. If you're someone who struggles to control those tricky variable costs, the late night takeout, the random online impulse buys, this highly tactile cash-based method is amazing for restricting overspending. We are basically taking the money off the plastic cards and bringing it right into the physical world. Here is exactly how you execute it. Step 1. Divide your variable monthly expenses by your pay periods and write that specific amount on a physical envelope for each category. Step 2, grab a separate envelope, write goals on it, and do the same math. Step 3, make sure you have a totally secure bank account set up. Step 4, this is crucial. On payday, pull your variable cash out, divide it into your category envelopes, and immediately deposit the goals money straight into your bank so it is locked away, out of sight, out of mind. Step 5. This is the golden rule. You only use the cash in the envelope for the listed expense. When the dining out envelope is empty, well, you're not eating out until the next paycheck. By following these 5 steps, you're building physical boundaries that make it totally impossible to accidentally spend next week's grocery money on tonight's pizza. At the end of the day, yes, the structural shifts in our global economy might make reaching traditional adulthood a bit harder than it was 50 years ago. The learning cycles are definitely longer, and yeah, the cost of living is higher. But as we've seen today looking at the research, true economic independence is a choice you can actively engineer. You have the tools, you have the math, and now you have the strategies. So what's your next move going to be? Are you going to remain caught in the accommodation trap? Or will you gather those statements, build that budget, and finally launch your independent future? Thank you so much for joining